Reverend William J. Barber has long tackled the issues of race, poverty, and hatred. Next month, his Poor People's Campaign will hold a digital assembly and march on Washington to draw attention to those and other civil rights issues. I recently spoke with Reverend Barber about the impacts of COVID-19 on communities of color for our ongoing initiative Chasing the Dream, Poverty and Opportunity in America. First of all, Reverend Barber, welcome to the program. I want to ask, what have the past 7 or 8 weeks in this trial for the United States, for the world, what has that taught you?
Well, it's taught a number of lessons. I think it's taught all of us a number of lessons. I hope that some people are understanding that this pandemic has been like a contrast die, and it has exposed the deep fissures and wounds that prior existed in this society, and that people understand that pandemics exploit the wounds of a society. And America has great wounds when it comes to the history of systemic racism and criminalization of poverty. Before this pandemic, 140 million people existed in poverty and low income. That's 43% of this nation. 61% of all African Americans, 66 million whites, which is about 27-28% of white population. And 700 people were dying a day from poverty and low income, according to a study by Columbia, before the pandemic ever hit. 250,000, 250,000 people a year, and 62 million people making less than a living wage. Then the pandemic hits, and we now see where upwards of 40% of those workers who make less than $40,000 may lose their job. We're seeing unemployment numbers like we haven't seen since the Great Depression. Poverty may jump by 20-30%. But we also learned that the danger of having narcissistic, egotistical, lying leadership in the White House, because our response to this pandemic has been criminal, literally criminal. And people are dying who did not have to die. The wealthiest nation in the world, we had just a horrendous response. And that should be shocking to people, that we still have people in the highest levels of government in our United States Senate and in the White House who are far too comfortable with other people's deaths. That ought to be shocking to us. And I must say this, we have seen that even in the Congress, on both sides of the aisle, they are too committed to a neoliberalism imagination of doing politics. So what did we get? The first three bills gave 83% of all the money to corporations. The first three bills, not one of the rescue bills guaranteed health care, guaranteed living wages, guaranteed that people's rent, they couldn't be evicted, guaranteed that their water couldn't be cut off. And so what are we seeing once again? This pandemic is destroying the poor and low-income communities, African-American communities, people of color, undocumented immigrants, but also it's not staying there. Because the pandemic may exploit those fissures, but it won't stay in the fissure.
One of the things that you said in the last week or so, you said Republicans have racialized poverty and Democrats have run from poverty. Explain that.
Well, when you look since the 1960s, I can do this in short order, and the Southern strategy that was implemented by Kevin Phillips and George Wallace and then Richard Nixon, the goal of that was to make the Republican Party the party of white people. And Lee Atwater actually explained it. He said in the early 60s, you could use the N-word and get elected, but by the late 60s, you couldn't do that. So he said we changed our language to talk about tax cuts and states' rights and basically the tax cuts argument that all of these folk making this free stuff, getting these free things like food stamps and so forth and so on, are black people that are pulling you down. Reagan suggested that when he opened his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And so that's a racialization of poverty. It's them, it's those people, it's their personal choices. It's not a matter of policy choices. It's not a matter that we are blocking living wages and blocking health care. On the other side, Democrats decided we're gonna focus on the middle class. We're gonna focus on the middle class. They got trapped in a neoliberalism argument. If we take care of the middle class, everything else is fine. You can hardly find a Democrat that will even say the word poor. They might say working people, they might say middle class, but they will not say the word poor, even though 43% of the nation is poor. So what do we end up having? We had since 2016, just to take one period of time, over 30 some odd presidential debates, 30 some of them on both sides of the aisle. 43% of the nation in poverty and low wealth, not one debate on poverty. Not one debate on the massive voter suppression that has caused state legislatures and the U.S. Congress to be filled with people who did not win the popular vote, but they won through racist gerrymandering and through voter suppression. And not one full debate on that issue. So we have both parties who have tended to, one racializes it, one runs from it, and the consultants. I actually had a presidential candidate that came to my church and said that the consultants tell them not to do poverty. They tell them that people will be offended if they talk about the poor. Well, the poor are saying we are offended by a nation that will not talk about poverty. And we're hearing that from the Appalachian Mountains to the poor people that we meet in California and Michigan and upstate New York, all the way down to Mississippi to Alabama. They are sick and tired that this nation is not dealing with systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism, which are the 5 interlocking injustices that are literally eating at the soul of this nation.
Do you think that the alternative to the current administration, what Joe Biden and whoever his vice president is, that the Democratic Party can deliver all that? Because what you're proposing seems to be a more progressive agenda than where the Democratic Party is today.
Listen, maybe 3 months ago, you were talking about what was practical, but now you got to talk about what is necessary. What's necessary? We're in the middle of a pandemic, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Roosevelt came to understand when you're in the middle of a Great Depression, you don't do what is normal. There were things that Roosevelt pushed in the Great Depression that he didn't stand for prior to the Great Depression. In fact, he criticized some of the people that stood for them. But in the midst of the Great Depression, he recognized we needed a new deal. We needed something historic. We didn't just need moderation. We needed something historic. And that's the moment we're in. So sometimes a moment creates the possibility for us to get out of this phony, false, left versus right, these puny debate categories that really mean nothing and really don't address the reality. This is the very time when you can put forth the faces of the poor and low wealth of every race, color, creed, and sexuality. And if you do, you're going to have a different kind of electorate. You're going to have a different kind of mobilization. Remember, we have been operating on a politics that is comfortable with 100 million people staying home. You know, Democrats and Republicans have basically decided to run within that is already mobilized. We got to expand the electorate. And you can only expand the electorate when you expand the vision. And it can't be about this is Biden's agenda or Bernie's agenda or Barbara's agenda or Harris's agenda. This has to be an agenda for the people. Now, it's not going to work unless you go from the bottom up. There's no way out of this unless you lift from the bottom. When you lift from the bottom, like a house, if you lift the bottom from the house, the whole house rises. So if Democrats ignore 43% of this nation, 140 million people, 1/3 of all the poor people live in the South, 1/3 of all white people live in the South. If you keep talking the same language about middle class and that's it, and not poor and low wealth people, if you can't even say their names, then you may not be able to expand the electorate. You may not be able, because just saying we want Trump out is not enough. You got to give people, they have to be heard. They have to know they're seen. But if you change it, our data tells us that 5 to 15% of poor and low income people are organized around an agenda for life, an agenda for transformation, an agenda that establishes justice and provides for the common defense. You don't even have to go outside of the Constitution. Use the constitutional language. I'm going to pass policies that promotes the general welfare of this nation for everybody. A moral agenda that follows our deepest religious values, that says that we care for the least of these first, and if we care for the least of these, then everybody's lifted. If you do that, you can connect, like we have white folk from the mountains of Kentucky and the coal mines with black folk in Alabama.
Given that economic injustice and inequality is so prevalent right now in the context of COVID, there are a lot of people who are considered essential workers, in some ways have also become expendable workers. How do you balance the need to keep them alive, safe, versus their interests in providing for themselves and their family, where they might be making, they're already making that difficult decision on a daily basis when they get out the door?
Well, first of all, we create a false choice, like you either live or you work and die. It's a false dichotomy. That's the problem right there. Again, that's that kind of locked in a certain kind of imagination. That's the first problem. The second problem is we don't act as though this just started with COVID. We act as though it's been around. The reason we're having the problem is because what we didn't address. So since the pandemic is like a contrast die in the body showing you what you didn't address, then why not follow what the contrast die is saying you ought to address? So for instance, in Germany, they have less than 3% unemployment because they created a relationship between the government and business owners to pay their workers to stay off the job for a long period of time. They created we could do that. We found three, think about it. When the corporations said, use the shock doctrine, said, we need $3 trillion. We said, okay, just give it to them. Treasury said, just give it to them. Well, if we should have invested that money in the workers. Well, now that's what we need to do in a new bill. We need to invest it in the work. We don't need to tell people you either live or you die. You go to work and die. The other reality is that when we look at low-wage workers and low income, I want to be honest with you as a clergy person, what I'm hearing. Most people that we're calling essential workers are so damn sick of that word, they don't know what to do because it has become a slogan. To them, it means expendable because they're saying, wait a minute, Reverend Barber, they said we're essential, but in the first 3 bills, they didn't lift our wages to living wages. They say we're in combat. Well, a combat soldier, if you go behind in a combat zone, you get an increase in rank, you get an increase in wage, you get a bonus and a GI Bill. They are sick of the phraseology. Dr. King used to say, America sometimes can have this strange reality of having the high blood pressure of creeds and the anemia of deeds. They are sick of being called essential, but it's treated expendable. So we're creating a false dichotomy between you live or you die and go to work and die and put in a lethal situation. That's like telling people you got to go to work, but we're gonna hold back the policies to protect you. So in essence, you're asking, as one nurse's aide said, you're asking people to participate in their own mass murder by going. We can't have that. We can do so much, but we're the wealthiest country. We claim we are the wealthiest country in the world, the only of the 25 wealthiest countries that do not offer health care that's attached to your body and not your job.